Of course, we've got time for a brilliant one-liner from James McGovern.
Seeing none, this closes the hearing portion.
Mr. Chairman, so no more witnesses? I was hoping Marjorie Taylor Greene would come and talk about her space lasers amendment. Anyway, but she's not here, so I will.
Without objection, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
Member DeLauro, we're trying every way in the world to save you from this, Chairman Cole.
Hey, man, it's in your bill, man.
And it may be because it was a Republican demand in order to be able to get.
I'm sorry, can we have order?
It may have been, I wasn't a party to it, but it may have been a Republican demand in order to get funding for Ukraine. That's what may have simply been a totally political issue in order to get to people who do not see the value, the U.S.'s value in providing aid to Ukraine. So you all ought to think about that and whether or not. It is not really, I just say that for me personally, it was the Senate package came forward with the way it was without this, but this is what the Republican majority wanted to do. So please talk to your colleagues about that. Do not talk to the Democrats about it.
I don't want to.
Right, of course, as I said in my opening statement, all of these are Republican-led bills. I didn't even want to do a sidecar. We didn't have to. I just wanted to do the Senate bill.
Take responsibility.
Yeah, if I can add, the loan program, though, the EU has the same program with Ukraine, this loan program. And so we thought that it made sense. And I think the former president agreed that, make this a loan, not just a giveaway.
Ranking Member DeLauro, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'd like you to sum up your opinion on the loan aspect of the money that goes to Ukraine. Do you believe it's a gimmick?
Look, as I said, I was very, very supportive of, I'm not supportive of using loans for emergency needs. That hasn't been the way in which we have moved in the past, okay? So it was the House Republicans' cost. You ready for that? The House Republicans' cost for getting the funds. It is a bad precedent, but that was the only way in which we could move on funds for Ukraine. And you want to talk about trying to get something done? We're here to try to get something done, not to put roadblocks, barriers to wherever you want to go on getting aid to Ukraine. That is what our job is to do. Forgivable loan, bad precedent, and which I'm opposed to, did not come out of the Senate bill, but that's how we needed to. That was the Republicans' price. So please, talk to your colleagues about it. Don't talk to the Democrats about it.
It sounds like you support the bill, though, so somehow you got...
I support the bill because we need to get aid to Ukraine, and you know what? It's about, someone mentioned up here, what we do in this body. And I've negotiated along with Chairman Cole appropriations bills over the years. Does everybody get what they want? No. Do we really compromise on issues for the greater good to try to move forward? Yes. That is what is called governing. That's why we all come here. That is, we come here to be able to govern and to get things done. In this respect, getting aid to Ukraine is imperative.
All right, let me move on and ask about Gaza. How much money is in here for Gaza, Ranking Member Meeks?
Well, it's $9 billion for humanitarian aid, not all of which is going to Gaza, but it's for humanitarian aid throughout the world, as it was in the Senate bill.
How much, Ranking Member DeLauro, how much of that will go to Gaza?
That is really, there isn't a specific number. As you probably know or maybe don't know, they never do earmark the funds that go to humanitarian assistance because something can come up in which there needs to be the flexibility in order to be able to provide humanitarian aid. As I said in my remarks, you are looking at Sudan, you're looking at Haiti, you're looking at Somalia. People have talked about I mean, the countries that are in the greatest need, including Gaza. So there is not a specific dollar amount.
Okay, look, I want to ask about the top line. How do we get the top line numbers for the military aid? Where did those come from? Anybody want to answer that? I'll ask Ranking Member DeLauro.
The numbers, quite honestly, mirror what came out of the Senate. And so that this package, and that's what the Speaker has talked about, and this is what the agreement was, and it was back and forth in which they came forward with what essentially was the Senate package.
So these top line numbers are pretty much what the Senate top line numbers are.
It's what came out of it first came forward with what the president had proposed earlier on, and then there was the deliberation about it in the Senate. The Senate came forward, and that the numbers that are being proposed here are essentially the numbers that had been asked for earlier on in this process, going back, I think, several months.
The Speaker told me that the reason the numbers are both the same is they both came from the Pentagon. And
look, I have to imagine, the numbers didn't come out of the air. When you do you're looking at what the estimates are, what's needed, what the costs. And by the way, I think it was mentioned, but we can look at what the it's probably coming from the administration and from the Pentagon. But there's money in here that deals with the replenishment, which is estimated. I think there's an estimate of overall of about $50 billion. That is for the U.S. Industrial base. And, we are providing the weapons, and then we need to make sure that we deal with national security, domestic national security, and that money is replenished. That's in here. That comes from the administration and from the Pentagon.
The gentleman yields.
I'll yield to Mr. Neguse.
I'm going to interject here. We do have a lot to get through today, so I'm going to ask people to be respectful of each other. I don't have any direct knowledge of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair is going to yield to the gentleman from Colorado. And once again, I want to remind members we have a history up here of being very, very generous with our time, but their time marches on. So with that bearing in mind that Tempest Fugit, the gentleman from Colorado, is recognized for his questions.
Well, I think the chairman, there are 9 Republican members of the Rules Committee. That admonishment is probably best left for for our colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have been very verbose today. But
Mr. Neguse, I used no time. Mr. Reschenthaler used no time. Ms. Fischbach used no time. So just bear that in mind.
Well, I appreciate that. Nonetheless, I'd like to ask a couple of questions. First and foremost, I guess I would just associate myself with the remarks of the Ranking Member DeLauro. In particular, I thought she gave an impassioned defense of the past 65 days. From my standpoint, I think it's shameful that it has taken 65 days since the Senate passed the National Security Supplemental on a bipartisan basis with 70 votes to get to this point, to finally be in a position in which we could consider individual component bills that largely resemble, with the exception of the sidecar, which we'll get to, the Senate bill, while our allies across the globe have been waiting for the Congress to act, waiting for House Republicans to act. Finally, we're poised to do so. And I'm disappointed that it's taken this long, but nonetheless, I'm grateful that we'll have, I hope, an opportunity to finally get this done in the next 48 hours. I do have some questions about the sidecar, and in particular the bill that Mr. Massey was, he covered a number of bills, but in particular one of the bills that he asked Chairman McCall about, the Repo Act. First and foremost, Ranking Member Meeks, how many bills are in this sidecar bill?
How many bills? There are, well, I can tell you there's no Democratic bills. I can tell you that.
Well, you've gotten to my second question. My understanding is there are 15 bills.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15.
15 bills that have been packaged into this sidecar agreement. None of them are Democratic bills. Chairman McCall, I have great respect for you and have enjoyed working with you, but I have to say I'm very disappointed that there isn't a single Democratic bill that the Republican leadership could not identify to put into this larger package, because I am aware of many bills that have passed your committee on a bipartisan basis that would merit inclusion.
One bill. There's one Democratic bill.
Can I respond?
Of course, by all means.
Every one of these bills is bipartisan.
Understood.
Has strong, and we, that was our litmus test, that we didn't want to put in, we weren't going to put a bill that was just a Republican bill. We picked bills that were bipartisan bills. And for a good reason. I mean, practically, you're not going to be able to pass it, you know.
There are many bills within the package, Mr. Chairman, that I'm supportive of. My point is, each one of them are Republican-led bills. I understand they have broad bipartisan support, but I would just encourage you in the future. I mean, we have a number of issues, hotspots around the world. Your committee is deeply engaged in addressing those challenges, and I would just encourage the committee, because I know you and the ranking member have a productive and robust partnership, and I think it's important to include bills from the minority in a package like
and every
this.
time we have a markup, I give the ranking member, we pass Democrat-sponsored bills, and they're all sitting over there in the Senate. I wish they would pass the Democrat bills we passed out of my committee in the Senate as well. And
we'll talk to the
has
Senate
a bill on
about that,
data
but-
privacy that we included in there as well.
In any event, Repo Act. My question, Chairman McCall, I'm trying to understand your argument and the exchange you had with my colleague from Kentucky. So it's your position that you have structured that bill to limit President Biden because you believe that he won't enforce the provisions of the bill? Is that that's your argument?
Because he has waived sanctions, including Nord Stream 2 and others, and we believe this issue is so important to protect our children from the threat of the PRC, we didn't want him to waive this provision. We wanted it enforced because he.
Has President
if we
Biden
put a
opposed
waiver,
this bill?
it could pass, but he could choose not to enforce it.
Has he opposed it? Has the administration put out a statement on administration policy against the bill?
I don't.
The answer is no. The Biden administration has not opposed the bill. Part of my frustration, Mr. Chairman, just to, again, all candor here, is that I don't think it's an intellectually consistent argument to suggest that this president, President Biden, who has forcefully made the case against Russian aggression in Ukraine, that your fears are about his abilities or his capabilities to hold the line and not the former president's, which of course was the nature of my colleague's criticism from Kentucky.
When we were, and we had a similar bill in my committee, they were not very keen about this bill in the beginning.
Sure.
So I guess it's kind of a trust thing that we want it enforced, and we don't want that he will exercise like he's done on Nord Stream 2 and Iran and those. And if I could, Mr. Chairman, in response to Mr. Massey, who's not here now, but the financial markets understand the targeted nature of this action to address Russia's egregious and illegal behavior. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell testified to the Financial Services Committee that it will not undermine the dollar, and the U.S. Treasury Department is of the same view. I just wanted to clarify that.
Is the gentleman asking unanimous consent to place that into the record?
Yes, I am, sir.
Without objections ordered.
So it sounds like, Mr. Chairman, I think your answer was it's a trust issue, and that you have more trust. I guess your argument is you have more trust for former President Trump than President Biden?
I think that was an issue that's was raised by Mr. Massey about tying his hands and that sort of thing. But I just, you talking about repo or TikTok?
I'm talking about the Repo Act.
Okay.
I'm talking about the Repo Act because I am struggling to understand how a straight-faced argument can be made that that bill was constructed in a way to somehow limit President Biden's hands because you don't trust him to implement this policy as opposed to former President Trump. Let me tell you.
It's not to be insulting to the president. It's just that we want this and we want this done. He does have a track record of waiving sanctions.
Sure. This is why
and he's done it several times. The Nord Stream was the most egregious one that we never thought a president would do that.
Okay, let me try to explain. I hear you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to explain my skepticism. The White House has not issued a statement of administration policy against the Repo Act. They have not given any indication that they won't forcefully implement the laws that we pass. The former president, although I don't know how he feels about this bill, but clearly his acolytes in the Congress vociferously oppose this bill because they believe that it will tie former President Trump's hands if he is elected president. So it's a tough argument for me to understand that you're making, that clearly all of his allies believe that you are doing this to tie his hands, not President Biden's, notwithstanding the argument that you're making today.
I appreciate your argument, but, why are you concerned about there not being a waiver if you believe the president won't waive it?
Oh, I'm not concerned about there not being a waiver.
Then what is the concern
I am concerned about you
If
making...
he's not going to waive it, then why
Correct.
do you care if there's a waiver in there?
My concern is that you have made the reasoning, the impetus for that provision, apparently your belief that President Biden will somehow waive it, when clearly that is not the case. Clearly the fear is that former President Trump...
There's no concern here, is there?
No concern from me. I'll tell you who the concern is from. Let me read you a tweet. This is from former President Trump's son. This was tweeted yesterday. It pains me to read this. These are not my words. Quote, why are these, again, it pains me, why are these GOP leadership losers like @Rep McCall pushing a bill that would do the bidding of Democrats and hurt my father's ability to negotiate an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine? That's his tweet. My point is simply that President Biden has been very clear about holding Russia accountable. And what I take great resentment at is the implication that somehow this Repo Act is being structured in a way to guard against mistrust of President Biden, when that's clearly not the case, nor is it the way anybody externally is reading the situation. Ranking Member Meeks, I'm welcome to expound on that if you...
Look, I agree with you. I mean, I have more concerns about President Trump, especially when it comes to Russia, because if you go by history, if I recall correctly, it was President Trump that had the Prime Minister of Russia in the White House showing him classified material. It was President Trump who just recently said to Russia, do what the hell you want to our allies. So clearly the concern would be on what President Trump would do with reference to his relationship with Russia. It is President Trump who said he trusts the information, the intelligence of Russia over the intelligence of the United States of America. Who are you going to trust? That's not President Biden. Those are the words of the former president of the United States. And you're going to trust him with Russia?
Well, I certainly agree. I support the Repo Act. I am glad that it has been included in that particular sidecar, and I just think it's important that we have honest, straightforward debate about the bills that we're considering and the reasons undermining them. I respect you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I just add,
of
this
course,
passed out of the Energy and Commerce Committee 40-2.
Right.
Pretty.
Very bipartisan bill.
It's a very,
And in the Senate
by a
as
very
well.
large margin.
Very much so. Yeah. And I'm hopeful.
And I'm not trying to tie anyone's hands. I mean,
I hear you.
I just think it's an important issue to protect our children from the communist China.
As do I. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank the chairman and gentleman from Texas. I thank each of you for being here in front of the Rules Committee, particularly good to see you, Mr. Cole, just a week removed. A couple of just questions generally to make sure, just for the record, and I don't want to belabor this, but I do want clarity because there's a lot that's been flying around. We are all aware, disagreements aside, of the porous nature of our southern border. Not going to dwell on it. We've covered it, but obviously, as I've stipulated, and I think my friend from Texas, Chairman McCall, would agree. I mean, we've had godly number of people that have been flooding across the border and dealing with all the issues involving that, tragedies we've recounted numerous times here. In particular, the data that was released recently that we're at 24,300 and X, I think, Chinese nationals that have come across the southern border that we know of, not counting gotaways, which is a number that exceeds all of 2023 fiscal year. So in 6 months, we've exceeded all of FY23. And that compares to a number of about 381 in FY21, the last year in which it was President Trump's policies predominantly driving the reality of the border. Is that, I assume the chairman would agree that poses a not insignificant national security threat to the United States of America, that we've got those kinds of numbers from what I'm understanding to be 85% single adults of that number of, so we're not talking about a lot of children and so forth, of that number of 24,300 X in 6 months. Does the chairman agree with that?
Yeah, I do. It is a national security threat. And let me just say, when we were in the White House at the beginning of the discussions, it was going to be 4 threats. Threat from Iran, the threat from Putin, the threat from China, and then the threat from our southern border. That's the back door. If we don't have the back door shut and the threats come in, and you know, as I do, as chairman of Homeland Security, when you're talking about 350 on the terror watch list, and how many do we not know about? When the world's on fire and Hamas is out there, and Afghanistan is turning into a terror ground again, they released all these prisoners from the Bagram base that are ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda. I'm very concerned that something's going to happen. And I think something will. And it's again, a real threat to our national security.
Yeah, and I agree with the chairman. And I would just say, without, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but just in general, those numbers, the extent to which you've got the fentanyl seizures have been running at about 1,000 pounds a month. The numbers just last month alone were about 190,000 at the southern border. I think close to 250,000 when you factor in southern border plus parole plus northern border and others of the number of people apprehended. But again, that's not counting the gotaways. And then you've got the known or suspected terrorists, the gentleman just referring to, that were already at about half of what we had last year, which was a real high at 169 is the data I have. That might be a little variable. But then specifically the policies of parole. For example, we have at least a known homicide suspect entering via the CBP-1 app just last year, July 2023, who was released into the United States and committed a murder and was arrested in Middletown, New York. My point of all of that is, and without going through all of that, is all of that is front and center. A lot has been wrapped into the political drama around HR2 and whether you do it or don't do it and who has it and all of that. But just simple fact of the matter, though, is in this year, whoever's fault it is, whether it's President Biden's or whether it's MAGA extremist Republicans, to use the vernacular of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, whoever's fault it might be, it remains true today that we have not passed and got the president to sign into law anything that would meaningfully change or alter what's happening at the border in a significant way. Is that a true characterization?
We have not, we passed HR2 out of the House.
Right. I said, but signed into law. Right. So we passed out of the House. But again, even just the back and forth aside about whose fault it all is, what has not happened is we have not signed into law anything to deal with the border.
But can I make a point?
Yeah.
I agree with that.
And I've been doing this for a long time.
Sure.
This is an enforcement issue. It's not as much of a legislative issue. We throw more money at this thing, but the problem is this. We had policies in the prior administration that worked. Remain in Mexico has been on the books for 30 years. It's just we finally had a president that would enforce it. So a lot of this we could enact, but if he's not going to enforce it, and that's it, remain in Mexico. I marked that up out of my committee as an HR2. He would rather us give him cover with some bipartisan watered down bill than something. Like he could go back to what the Trump administration did with existing authorities and secure that border. He's the one that made the choice not to do it. He reversed the policies. When I went over, when we present our case to the Senate in the so-called trial that didn't happen, get this. Mayorkas, there's a statute, as you know, aggravated felons must be detained, shall be detained. You know, as an attorney, that shall means mandatory. Yep. Who are aggravated felons? Murderers, rapists, pedophiles, drug traffickers. And he sends a memo to his Border Patrol agents saying, hey, don't take prior convictions into account when determining whether to detain. So what was the result of that policy? All these dangerous, violent criminals are released in our society.
So, and I agree with the chairman, and I'll just move to the conclusion on this, which is that I partially agree with the chairman. I recognize his point. I agree with the general point about the blame there. Where my position is that there's an Article 1 responsibility to force an administration that doesn't follow the law to follow the law, and importantly, to recognize that even under a president that does follow the law, whether it was Obama or Trump or anybody before, you know, Jay Johnson recognized problems. We had problems with the Trump administration, with TVPRA, with Flores, with judicial opinions, with a cross-section of the law that's hard to enforce. All of those things that we need to address it, and we need to address those issues in order to actually secure the border, and Congress does need to act. And so my question is, and we know the answer, and we have disagreements on the merits of weighing what we should do on these things. But to be clear, we had a rule last night that was focused on an H.R. 2 play. Some of us disagreed with that play because we thought it was, frankly, a fiction. It was just a sideshow that wasn't going to result in anything. So, but this rule will not include anything that touches the border in any meaningful way. That's correct, right?
Well, there is a separate vote on the border with a separate rule.
Correct. Yeah. And that rule we took up last night, that's been effectively suspended. But we have not, nothing in this bill, this rule, the set of bills that we're talking about here would address the border, correct?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like you're getting above my pay grade a little bit, but let me just say, from a pragmatic standpoint, they have not entertained H.R. 2. They will not entertain it now. And the situation is very dire in the spots that we're trying to address. And, I wish it was, I agree with you. We're both from Texas. And I wish it was a perfect world. And I hear the chairman, and I'm not trying, and I do not mean to put him on the spot about Texas and what we're doing and weighing all of this. I'm just, for the purposes of for those who are reaching a calculation that's different than some of our colleagues, that it is important for the world to know that we are going to proceed with a rule here that is going to advance foreign aid to the tune of $95 billion, roughly, of various forms and fashions, predominantly 2/3 of which going to Ukraine, another block going to Israel, another block going to Taiwan, another block going to submarines and other stuff and things that, are overall defense needs, and that none of it is going to address the southern border. And I agree with the gentleman that money wouldn't help the southern border. You got to have changes to force the administration to enforce the law. Asylum is a genuine no.
Correct. Yeah. And parole, and the brain abuse and parole. So the second question is that I believe I'm correct, that of the dollars that are going, that the loan program only really applies to I'm going to roughly round the $8 billion-ish of the non-lethal accounts, right, that are for the Ukrainian government can use for other purposes. Is that roughly correct? That the loan can only apply to that subset of the money. And so then of that, I am under the understanding that the president can forgive up to 50% of that, and the other 50% could be forgiven in the future, but only with congressional action. Is that a correct characterization? I'm looking back at staff too, because I'm always wondering it. I just don't know the facts. Yeah, Mr. Cole, if you have the answer to that too. Chairman Cole.
As I understand it, yes, although there's still a congressional component. That is, we could disapprove of the loan forgiveness.
Okay, so the president could unilaterally the president could decide to forgive, but we could disapprove of that forgiveness. Correct. Got it. And then in the future, Congress would have to be consulted before forgiving the second half.
Also correct.
Okay, all right. Just so I know, there is, as I think the Democratic ranking member acknowledged, I think that there is humanitarian aid, that some of which could go to Gaza, and we're acknowledging that of some amount of the $9 billion, it wouldn't be the full amount, right? Because some of that's for refugees, some of it's for foreign aid, but there's $5.6 billion, I think, of the 9 or something like that could ultimately get to Gaza. Well, but I thought and I'm not trying to be pejorative. It's just facts. I thought of the $9 billion, I thought 4-ish is refugee specific, and another. Is that not true? Did I have that wrong? Okay, I thought there was a characterization. Is that not accurate? That like 5.x is available for humanitarian generally, and like 4-ish is specific to refugees.
Apparently, there are two accounts, but they're both for the. It's not divided, but it's
Okay.
the way in which you said.
Okay,
There
I
are
just
two
again
accounts
just
in which that money flows.
I'm just trying to for the few members watching all of this and a few Americans, I want them to at least know the facts on it. Obviously, I've got concerns about that in terms of dollars that can flow and end up in the hands of Hamas.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
The one point is, and this was a very important point, is we prohibit all funding to UNRWA.
Sure.
Because UNRWA, as you know, 12 employees were part of the invasion.
Yep.
Israel, their headquarters were underneath, or Gaza's Hamas's headquarters were underneath UNRWA in the tunnel. So none of this money can go to UNRWA.
Sure, and I appreciate that, and that is a good move. And I introduced legislation 3 years ago to defund, UNRWA, recognizing why that's a travesty. I wish we'd have done that before October 7th. We had votes in our appropriations bills last September to do that. I applaud Republicans. We were trying to do that. But I would note, though, that a lot of these funds are fungible, and just knocking down that one account on UNRWA doesn't necessarily prohibit through these billions of dollars flowing. And in fact, many watchers of this, including friends of mine in Israel, who have raised the question to me in direct communication, saying this additional money, while we're funding Israel and they want the funds, and they do, they recognize this money would be used by an administration that is hell-bent on, frankly, interfering with Israel to find a way to get that money to ways that, and if it gets to Gaza, it gets to Hamas.
But my direction is private NGOs, Catholic Relief Services, right? World Food Program. These are, David Beasley, World Food Program, now Cindy McCain, but now Catholic Relief Services. They're on the ground.
Yeah.
And they should be taking over the responsibilities of UNRWA.
Well, my only observation on that is I don't have a lot of confidence in NGOs after what I've been seeing down on the southern border. But moving on, just for the sake of time, and I'm going to skip a couple things that I wanted to cover. But one general question for you, Mr. McCall, which may not be fair to you versus another member, and I want to be careful in the way I ask this for purposes of national security and everything else. But how would we characterize America's relative, within a publicly available to talk about non-classified way, if it's possible, and it may not be, relative stockpile of munitions from today, from where we were, say, in March of 2022, 2 years ago, before we were engaging in support for Israel, for Ukraine, well, Israel too, but for Ukraine, and again, within the parameters of what we can publicly talk about.
Yeah, and I don't have the exact numbers, but what I'll tell you is what we have put into Ukraine are older, the old weapons. Old stockpiles that were sitting around, and what this 80% again of this funding goes to our own defense industrial base to modernize and update our defense industrial base and produce new weapons that are better. We're giving them old stuff, and Eastern Europe's given all the old Russian equipment that they have, so they're getting the older things. We want to build the newer and better. We're going to put a lot of money into, this map shows a pretty good, where all this is going to go to states to provide a lot of jobs. I have to say, Mr. Roy, you're my friend from Texas, that we have a defense industrial base problem.
Yeah, and I concur.
And it's 100%. A national security problem. And that's the thing I like about the bills. We put 80% of it to fixing that defense industrial base that I believe is broken.
Well, with what did you have, Chairman Cole?
To Chairman McCall's point, and your very, very good question, an enormous percentage is replenishment. I mean, well over $24 billion. Same time, one of the areas, and I want to be very careful how I say this, but let's just take an item like 155 millimeter shells, okay? What we've done so far has more than doubled the capacity of the United States to produce those shells. And what will happen in this supplemental, and this is, from Defense Subcommittee work, will more than double it again. So, and Chairman McCall is exactly right. I mean, what we my district has air defense artillery in it at Fort Sill, and we trained a lot of the Ukrainians that are using the Patriot, but they were training on older weapon systems. There's 4 different varieties of these. They were playing on 1s and 2s. We're buying 3rd and 4s. So there is, a real effort to increase the capacity to produce, maintain the stockpiles that we need, and again, move the older stuff out, which is still better than anything they had available to them. But I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I just wanted to share that.
No, it is.
For 1 second.
Yes, ma'am.
Just on that issue, because I've asked that question. This is a DOD estimate that at least $50 billion of the package is for the U.S. defense industrial base across 30 states. So, and that is, that's what DOD is estimating.
Well, and I think the gentlelady, and there's some of these things that we can't get into detail here in a public setting, and I'm aware of that. And I wanted to bring that out for a number of reasons, because there's a lot of, and everybody's guilty of it, there's a lot of sort of painting with a broad brushstroke of why people are concerned with, oppose, or otherwise where they land on certain of these issues. One can be, as I would characterize myself as, fully supportive of wanting to fund Israel, fully cognizant of the dangers of not holding the line against Putin, but still be adamant of our need to secure our own border, differences of opinion aside about how, but having failed to do so, and simultaneously concerned of whether or not we're going to be able to succeed in Ukraine and how the money has been previously spent. So even here today in the testimony, we have heard, but in a positive, I think, posturing by the chairman, I think, of saying we're going to try to release and force the administration to provide at least certain weapons that might help them win it, and be more aggressive on that front. But meanwhile, a lot of my constituents are going, well, wait, we had $113 billion, and some of that's been allocated, and I get there's different ways to frame those dollars, that was already put forward and appropriated. And you're saying, well, okay, how was that spent? And so now we're trying to say, well, if Ukraine needs more in order to, hold the line, and to be clear, I don't have a clear mission out of this administration. I don't know whether we're talking about the 1991 lines. I don't know whether we're talking about, every inch of Crimea, every inch of Donbass. I don't know whether we're talking about, we're trying to buy time to hold the line on the western edge of the front and, east of Kyiv to try to prevent them from coming to Kyiv, but then have a serious discussion and a ceasefire about the territories that's already been disputed and gained by Russia. I don't have the foggiest clue of what our administration's position and posture is on that with clarity, because we have gotten different views out of the administration on that. There has been, kind of the lean into what Mr. Zelensky wants and say, we want, 1991, we want every inch of the territory. And then there's been more, we just want to make sure we can hold the line and don't let them advance because we don't want them to get anywhere near the western side of Ukraine and therefore be right on the line with Poland and our friends there. Yeah. And look, I'm not nearly as traveled as the chairman because of my committees of jurisdiction don't take me there. But one of my earliest trips was when I was Senator Cruz's chief of staff. I went on a trip to over a week to Jerusalem, Poland, Estonia, and Kiev. I'd say Kiev because when I went there, that's how we said it. Kyiv now. And was very steeped in what they face. And I just think it's really important for the entire world to understand the dynamic of the dispute at the moment, that it's not some monolithic isolationists who don't want to support our role in the world to prevent a Putin and to stand for democracy, but it is a real and reasoned debate about priorities when, if you look at during Reagan's time, when you look at the relative debt to GDP ratio under Reagan, right, when we were probably at about a 37%-ish when he did the buildup in the early 80s of our debt to GDP. Today, we're now $1.10, $1.20, depending on how you count the debt. And so we're in a real problem. And when you look at the overall defense spending, so we've talked here just now about ramping up the defense industrial base on the back of Ukraine. That might be a good thing for our country to get our production level up. But at what cost over there? Will we win? Is there a mission that's achievable here? How many Ukrainians have to die, depending on how we get there in the process, which is a very real concern? I think the gentlelady's point was in kind of the negative. The ranking member was, hey, how many Ukrainians have to die before we act? Some of us are saying, I think, at least with some reason to debate, like, I want to help you. How many Ukrainians have to die while this perpetuates without a will to go make sure we win it? How many Ukrainians are dying right now because we're funding it without a very clear, authoritative path to victory to ensure that we're going to get it done? So I think those are questions that some of us are wrestling with vis-a-vis this administration, how much money we should then fund into that. And then meanwhile, our borders being wide open with Chinese foreign nationals coming across the border and so forth. And a last point about this, about how we fund war. There's been a lot of discussions in the think tank world, which is only halfway relevant, really, generally speaking, about, you know, what you might call the ghost budgeting, right? Since basically September 11th, we have been funding effectively endless conflicts of various sorts. And people say that in a pejorative sense. I don't even mean it that way. There have been very reasoned and important engagements that we've been carrying out. But we've been doing that with OCO. We've been doing that with budget line items with supplemental spending like we're doing now. Whereas prior to September 11th, we were forcing sacrifice among the American people to say, okay, if your blood and or your treasure are going to be sent into battle, that you have to sacrifice. There's going to be increased taxes. There's going to be war bonds. There's going to be, you're going to stop buying sugar. You're going to stop buying tires. You're going to have something that you're going to have a stake in that as a country. And we have not been doing that. We've literally done nothing but borrow money to fund conflict for the last 25 years. That, I believe, is a fundamental problem and disconnect here. So to the concern that I have here is that plus border equals problem with the rule. Last point I'll make, and then I'll yield back for purposes of time, is this notion of this being kind of an open process. And with all due respect to the former chairman and the current chairman of appropriations, and I hear what he's saying. But in truth, for the average American, understand, what we've got now, I think to the approval of our Democratic colleagues, is effectively the Senate bill broken into some pieces, put down on the floor, yes, with some possible amendments, largely all predetermined and pre-cooked, and it's going to be what we call MERVed. That's a weird inside the Beltway term for smashing it back together. They're going to be put back together to send over to the Senate in roughly the structure of the Senate bill. This is why we know, and the reporting confirms, that Senator Schumer and to some degree Leader Jeffries have all applauded that this is the result that they want. The reason President Biden yesterday was saying that he's applauding it is it's the result the president wants. This is to achieve the objective of effectively the Senate bill from 65 days ago. Therefore, that is why some of us have strong reservation, and more than strong reservation, but objection. Because this is not putting Ukraine on the floor for a week of full unfettered debate like we're having here. This is a good conversation. The panel has laid out, I think, a whole lot of really important points about what we need to do as a country. But what we've done is decided, and we've decided it in the way we typically do, without the full-throated debate I think you should have on the floor on independent bills, or if you're going to package it together, then last point I'll make is you should honor the commitments that you make. And with all due respect to the Speaker, when the Speaker said, for example, on November 5th, 2023, we can do all these things together, but when you couple Ukraine and the border, that makes sense to people. Or when the Speaker says on December 5th, 2023, I explained that supplemental Ukraine funding is dependent upon enactment of transformative change to our nation's border security laws. Or when the Speaker said on December 12th, 2023, from the very beginning, when I handed the gavel, we needed clarity on what we're doing in Ukraine and how we'll have proper oversight of the spending of precious taxpayer dollars, and we needed transformative change at the border. Or as the Speaker said at the border, down in Texas in January, quote, I told the President that I've been saying for many months, and that is we must have change at the border, substantive policy change. I could go on and on. I won't. This is where the people that I represent fall. And that is why I have strong reservations and concerns and don't believe that I can support the rule. The gentlelady's been wanting to talk, and I'll certainly yield to the gentlelady.
I appreciate gentlemen yielding, and I thank you. And just as a point of clarification, because there's been a lot of discussion about the border. But when there was a bipartisan agreement overall, and the border piece was, and this was quite afterward when the former president indicated his opposition to the bill, and then it fell apart, and we were no longer going to have any border piece of it. I just think it's important to note, because we keep making reference to border security, okay? This was Division B, Border Security and Combating Fentanyl Supplemental Appropriations, 2024. And I don't have time here for the committee to read what was then excised, and what the Republicans have walked away from what was in this portion of the bill in terms of border security. In the criminal division, combating human trafficking and smuggling that affect U.S. border communities. This is the Texas communities that we're talking about. Yes, additional immigration teams. Marshal services, federal prison detention, Drug Enforcement Administration, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, federal law enforcement training centers. I'm not reading it all because it's just too much. There was efforts on the unaccompanied children program. USCIS Direct Hire Authority, ICE Direct Hire Authority, Supplemental Commissioner Authority and definitions, training for U.S. Border Patrol, electronic notices to appear. It goes on. Again, there was substantial approval in a bipartisan way on border security measures. And when the former president made his said, this is not something we want to provide a win for. I think the American public needs not just to hear border security, but I think the American public has got to understand where the Republicans have really walked back on border security by saying no to this. You can just continue to use that phrase and a pejorative way, but not talk about what it is that was relinquished in terms of getting control of the border. And I am someone who believes that we do have to have border security and get control of the border.
And I appreciate that. I want to give the chairman time to speak, and I want to be able to get my time back. But the chairman wanted to engage.
Yeah, just quickly to add a couple of things, and I didn't particularly want to be drawn into the border discussion, but I will add this. It does matter how you arrive at a deal. We produced H.R. 2 through a normal committee process. People got their fingers on it. They negotiated, they fought, they came to a product. They moved the product not only out of committee but across the floor. With all due respect to our friends in the Senate, that's not what happened there.
Yeah.
I actually don't think it's fair to say there was a bipartisan deal. There was a deal between three senators.
Right.
And when,
$7.
one side, look, these are friends of mine. I'm not critical of anybody. But the process that was set up, it would have been better if they'd have done, they don't have to take what we do. They'd been better off to take what we did and change it however they want in a normal committee. That's how people come to deals. And the Senate has moved away from that, and I regret that. But all that aside, I think my friend made so many good points about the concerns that all of us have about the conduct of the conflict in Ukraine. I can hardly think of anything that you said that I disagree with. I worry about the lack of defined objectives. I worry about the open strategy. I will tell you this, and I will say this, maybe not in defense, but in explanation of the administration. We had a defense subcommittee hearing on appropriations several months ago, may have even been late last year, where these questions were raised. And we had an Assistant Secretary of State for International Security, director of operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Secretary or Assistant Secretary for International Security made the point. She said, look, the objective is probably, it needs to be obvious that what Russia did was a strategic failure. And so that nobody does anything like this again. And this was ahead of the counteroffensive, which did not go as well as we would have hoped. I think that's fair to say, or Ukraine would have hoped. And she said that may well impact how you define that. Now, I look at it and I can say to this point, Russia has pushed Finland and Sweden into NATO. I guarantee you that's not something they wanted to do. To this point, they've suffered over 300,000 casualties. That's not something they planned on or wanted to do. To this point, they've been forced into measures they thought they would never have to take. They thought this would be a war that was over in weeks, not many months, now into its third year in some way. But I give the Ukrainians most credit at all. They're doing the fighting and dying. We've been pretty indispensable to that effort.
That's right.
So have our friends in Europe who've provided enormous amounts. I've never seen them step up like this. And there are a dozen countries who have actually committed a larger percentage of their GDP and a larger percentage of their budgets than us. And that's their credit. They're closer, you know, and I get one. If you're from Poland or you're from the Baltic states, you're from Moldova, you know, you look at this a little bit differently than we do because you don't have the luxury of distance and the relative security of the United States. So I do think this is evolving. I do think, however anybody votes on it, I really respect the different points of view in the Congress on this. And I'm very careful about not calling people that oppose Ukraine isolationists because they aren't. Most of them support Israel. Most of them support what we're trying to do in the Western Pacific. How can you be an isolationist if that's it? They've got a problem about how this war is being conducted, the nature of our commitment, the lack of strategy. There are, I will say this, in the legislation we have, and I'm not going to tell you I'm 100% satisfied with it because I'm not, but there's a lot more oversight requirements than there ever were in the Senate bill. There is a requirement that they produce a strategy. Whether they do or not, as you know, you've been around here a while too as both a staff and a member. Just because we tell them to do something doesn't mean an administration of either side always do what we tell them to do. But there is more in that. And I will say this is not the package the Senate wanted. They sent us what they wanted. They're getting back something different. Now, my friends made the points, which I agree with, that financially, this is broadly the same thing, but it is brought in components where people can vote individually how they choose to, and you can make it very apparent, I'm not for this, but I am for this. Or you can be against it all. But the body will work its will. Individual members will get to vote how they want to. If you support Israel, you won't have to vote for Ukraine. And on the other side of the aisle, you know, some of my friends are very skeptical about the Israeli aid component, would like to attach a lot of conditions to it, do stuff like that. But we're not going to force them to vote for Israeli aid because they were for Ukrainian aid. You know, that I think is a big difference. And it's also going to force the Senate, again, to accept some measure we want. Is it perfect? No. But to my friend, the ranking member on appropriations point, it's governing. It's a compromise. It's kind of the best we could do in the time frame that we have. But that doesn't take anything away from the legitimacy. My friend from Texas' points are about the process and honestly about some of his concerns, because I share some of those very same concerns, about the manner in which the administration has conducted the war. I think those are fair things to point out. I would just, again, say we are at a critical point. I kind of look at this in for a penny, in for a pound. I do not want to leave an ally high and dry. And frankly, I don't want to see happen in Ukraine what happened in Afghanistan. I do not want to see that kind of situation unfold. I think it's a terrible message for the rest of the world. I think what happened in Afghanistan was a terrible message to the rest of the world. I think that's one of the reasons why we're here right now. So with that,
So-
that's a long time. I appreciate.
If I could, I don't want to cut off any of the panelists. I'm not trying, but on my time, the panel has gone a while, so I want to be able to yield back to the chairman. But I have to make one response to the ranking member, and then I want to yield back, and that is on the border issues.
Right.
The package bill, would have demonstrably codified the mass release of individuals by its own wording.